Hey guys! Today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. By December 2015, they seemed like a perfectly ordinary family in the quiet Swiss town of Ruti. Carla Schauer Freiburghaus was a caring mother, a devoted wife, and a respected member of the community. Her two sons, 19-year-old Dion and 13-year-old David, were full of life and dreams. Dion had a girlfriend, Simona, who spent most of her time at their home. Carla's husband, George, left early each morning for work. His usual absence on Mondays became routine, and it would one day play a tragic role. On the surface, nothing hinted at trouble. The family was preparing for Christmas, decorating the house, picking out gifts, just like hundreds of others. They lived peacefully, completely unaware that someone nearby was watching them, quietly piecing together a scheme of revenge, pain, and fear. That someone was Thomas Nick. He lived only about 500 feet from the Schauer home, unnoticed and seamlessly blending into society. Outwardly, he appeared to be the model young man, supposedly a medical student, walking his dogs, politely greeting neighbors. But behind that facade lay a twisted fantasy, a disturbing obsession with David, and a carefully crafted scenario of aggression. Thomas had studied the family in advance, trolling the internet, direct observation, even using a fake cover as a school counselor. For weeks, he figured out when George left, who was in the house, at what times, and when he could strike. His computer's IP address even revealed that before the crime he was searching for information on the Schauers, who they were, where they lived, and constructing his own agenda. Nothing that happened was spontaneous. It was a coldly premeditated plan. While the town went about its daily routine, Thomas Nick already had the day fixed in his mind, a day that would change everything forever. That day was Monday, December 21st, 2015, just days before Christmas. The streets of Ruti were decked with wreaths and lights, and people rushed about buying gifts. Inside one house, however, time stood still. George left for work early, as usual, leaving Carla, her sons Dion and David and Simona at home. A quiet morning, seemingly like any other. Soon, there was a knock at the door. Carla answered, and standing on the doorstep was a young man with a confident demeanor and a folder in his hands. He introduced himself as a school counselor, claiming he had come to speak with David. His tone was calm and convincing, and he held what looked like official documents. Nothing about him raised suspicion. Carla recognized his face. It was Thomas, a local guy who was known around town as a supposed medical student. She let him in without hesitation. Inside the house, Thomas began telling a bizarre story. He claimed David had allegedly been involved in bullying and that one of his classmates had taken a tragic step as a result. To make his story more believable, he even produced a fake farewell letter. It all sounded like a terrible prank, but the way he spoke gave it an air of credibility. Once he felt he had gained her trust, Thomas's tone suddenly shifted. He pulled a knife and plastic zip ties from his backpack. First, he forced Carla to tie David's hands. Then he did the same to Dion and Simona. In a matter of moments, all three were helpless and restrained. Thomas then made his demand. He wanted a large sum of cash. He ordered Carla to leave the house, withdraw the money, and return. In exchange, he promised no one would be harmed. Terrified and overwhelmed, Carla complied. Surveillance footage showed her withdrawing the first amount, about $1,100, at 9:50 a.m. 20 minutes later, she took out nearly $10,800 more. On the footage, she appears panicked, without makeup, her face strained and confused. To most passers-by, it might have looked like nothing unusual, but to those who knew her, it was deeply alarming. Even then, Carla didn't call for help. Thomas had her completely under psychological control. He insisted she was being watched, claimed he had an accomplice, and warned that any wrong move would cost her sons their lives. The fear was paralyzing. Carla returned home with the cash, praying that the nightmare would finally be over, but it was only just beginning. When Carla came back with the money, She still clung to the hope that Thomas would now leave, but he had no intention of doing so. Without a word, he told her to sit down and then tied her up, just like the others. Now, all four, Carla, her sons, and Dion's girlfriend, were bound with plastic restraints, unable to resist. Then, Thomas reached into his backpack again, but this time, it wasn't for cash or documents. What he pulled out looked like something from a disturbing fantasy. Items no one would associate with innocent fun: handcuffs, duct tape, gags, a lighter, ropes, rubber objects. He had hidden these tools ahead of time. Every part of this had been planned. Every detail had been thought through in advance. Everyone braced for the moment, expecting Thomas to lash out at Carla. But instead, he turned to David. It was David he chose as the primary target. Right in front of his family, Thomas subjected the teenager to unspeakable cruelty for 20 long minutes. And during the entire ordeal, he recorded everything on his phone, almost as if he wanted to preserve the horror as a personal trophy. No one could intervene. Carla, Simona, and Dion were all bound and gagged, helpless to do anything but watch. They sobbed and trembled in fear as they witnessed a deeply disturbing act that defied comprehension. Thomas didn't just torment one person. He psychologically shattered everyone in the room. He made them spectators in a twisted, real-life horror. By the time he stopped, Thomas had recorded at least 8 separate videos. These would later serve as critical evidence in court. But in that moment, it was the grim culmination of his distorted control. One might assume he would flee after such a horrific scene. But Thomas had no intention of leaving. He wanted to finish what he started. He approached each restrained person, first David, then Dion, Simona, and finally Carla, and inflicted fatal injuries with a sharp object, targeting their necks with chilling precision. One by one, they fell silent. Yet Thomas knew that even silence can speak volumes. He was aware that evidence, his DNA, his actions, remained on David's body. So his final act was to destroy everything. He doused the rooms with a flammable liquid and set the house on fire. He wanted everything to vanish. Everything except himself. The fire spread quickly. Thick black smoke poured into the neighborhood. If not for a nearby neighbor who saw the flames and immediately called emergency services, the damage might have been even worse. Firefighters arrived promptly, but they could do little except put out the blaze. No one survived. The smoke may have cleared, but the truth it carried could never be hidden again. As firefighters pulled bodies from the charred remains of the house, and investigators carefully documented what they found: 4 victims, signs of severe trauma, and the unmistakable mark of fire. One man still knew nothing: George, Carla's husband, the only one who left that morning on routine business, heading to work, like always. He had no idea that what unfolded in his home was nothing short of a waking nightmare. When he was informed that his entire family was gone, the world he knew collapsed. Carla, his beloved wife, their sons, David and Dion, and even Dion's girlfriend, Simona, none had survived. He never had the chance to say goodbye. He had left that morning unaware it was the last time he would ever see them. But for law enforcement, his heartbreak wasn't enough to rule him out. From the start, George was considered the primary suspect. It wasn't personal, it was standard procedure in a case of this scale. You start with those closest. George understood, but that didn't make it any easier. George was called in for questioning under the pretense of a simple conversation. But as the discussion went on, the tone shifted. The questions became sharper, more pointed. Investigators searched his car, confiscated his phone, and reviewed any surveillance footage where he might appear. They even examined his fingernails, hoping to find traces of ash, burns, scratches, anything that could be used as evidence. His workplace was raided. The agency where he worked was turned upside down, colleagues were questioned, and they searched for any sign of involvement. George could feel the judgment in the stares around him. People suspected he might be responsible for the most horrific crime imaginable against his own family. And the worst part wasn't even the suspicion. It was the silence. No one reached out. No one offered comfort. No one said those simple human words, "I'm so sorry." he was left alone with his grief. A grief that now felt invalidated, treated with skepticism. His loss wasn't met with sympathy. It became a line of inquiry. He later said there were moments when he wanted to vanish entirely, to disappear. How does one keep going when you've lost everything and still have to prove you're not to blame? Fortunately, the truth began to emerge from the ashes. Surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, ATM records showing Carla withdrawing money, all slowly confirmed that George had no connection to the tragedy. He was miles away at the time of the crime. His alibi was rock solid. Only then, for the first time since that horrific day, did the authorities clear him. But the emotional damage had been done. Yes, he survived. But surviving was only half the battle. The hardest part was continuing to live, knowing he would never again hold his family. And worse, knowing that in their darkest hour, he wasn't there. And afterward, he was treated like the villain. Once the police were confident George had no role in what happened, all attention turned to the real perpetrator. Pressure grew with each passing day. 4 lives lost, including a minor. A house burned down. The public demanded answers, but the criminal had seemingly vanished. Still, Swiss investigators had something on their side: patience and precision. They brought in specialists from the cold case unit, even though the case was fresh. Investigators focused on what kind of preparation might have gone into such a targeted act. Because a plan like this is never random. It requires groundwork. That line of thinking led to an idea that seemed odd at first. What if the perpetrator had searched for his targets online ahead of time? The Schauer Freiburg house name wasn't common. It stood out, not like Smith or Mueller. So anyone who had searched that name before December 21st, 2015, was immediately of interest. A digital investigation began. Through data requests to internet providers, investigators obtained a list of all IP addresses that had searched for the Schauer family in the weeks leading up to the crime. One stood out instantly. It traced back to a location just about 500 yards from Carla's house. The address led to a man named Thomas Nick. At first glance, nothing seemed suspicious. A quiet man in his early 30s, living with his mother. He walked dogs in the neighborhood and volunteered as a youth coach at a local sports club. He had no regular job, but wasn't on any public assistance and had no criminal record. To most people, he seemed like a typical, maybe even exemplary resident. The more the police studied Thomas, the more unsettling things became. His life followed a strict, almost obsessive routine. He walked his dogs at the same time every day, followed the exact same paths, and returned home nearly to the minute. Everything appeared to be under perfect control, like he was living out a script. And in that meticulously choreographed schedule, there was one glaring break. On December 21st, the day of the crime, his phone went completely dark. No pings, no movements, no calls, no data. It was as if he'd intentionally turned it off or switched to airplane mode. It wasn't just suspicious, it was too perfect of a coincidence. That was the moment investigators realized they might have their first real suspect, but the evidence was still circumstantial. Internet search history, a conveniently silent phone, and geographic proximity. Not enough for an arrest, but more than enough to warrant surveillance. And so, they began tracking him. Soon, another red flag emerged. Thomas had a habit of visiting the same Starbucks in a neighboring town. On the surface, it looked harmless. But law enforcement had long suspected that someone was using the cafe's Wi-Fi to upload illegal content. When they compared the timestamps of those uploads with Thomas's visits, they matched. Even more troubling, among the files traced to that location were videos featuring boys who bore a striking resemblance to David Schauer. This was no longer a coincidence. This was a direct lead. Authorities began to believe Thomas Nick wasn't just a quiet neighbor. He had a clear agenda. By May 2016, investigators knew almost everything about Thomas, except the most critical detail. Was he actually inside the Schauer home on the day of the tragedy? They had plenty of clues, but nothing definitive. They needed something irrefutable. DNA. So, they set a trap. The setting, his usual Starbucks spot, where he spent hours working on his laptop. Police planned a visible yet legally sound operation, a random roadside sobriety checkpoint, seemingly conducted by traffic officers. And on the morning of May 12, 2016, just like always, Thomas took his dogs out and ended up right along that route. Officers stopped him, explained politely that it was a routine check, and asked him to take a standard breathalyzer test. Thomas didn't suspect a thing. He knew he hadn't been drinking and blew into the tube without hesitation. What he didn't know was that even a breathalyzer can yield DNA. The sample was sent to the lab. A few days later, the results came in. Thomas's DNA was a full match with material found on David. That was enough to obtain a warrant. But the investigators wanted more. They didn't just want to arrest him. They wanted to catch him in the act. No one knew if Thomas still had incriminating evidence, photos, videos, a list of potential future victims. There was a chance his laptop was still on him, and they hoped to seize it while it was in use. So the surveillance continued, quiet, relentless. Then, something shifted. Thomas seemed to sense he was being watched. He stopped going to Starbucks, changed his walking routes, avoided crowded places. Police nearly lost track of him, until 3 days later, he returned. Same table, same coffee, same laptop. At that very moment, a team of plainclothes officers entered the cafe. There was no shouting, no chaos. They calmly approached Thomas and asked him to come with them. He realized it was over. He didn't resist. On him were a laptop, several flash drives, and his personal backpack. During questioning, Thomas acted with chilling composure. No emotion, just cold logic. He didn't try to deny anything, nor did he make excuses. He admitted everything. Yes, he was responsible. Yes, he had planned it all. Yes, he had filmed it. Yes, he had been watching the family ahead of time. That marked the beginning of a new phase in the investigation. What once seemed too horrific to be real was now confirmed by his own words. But even seasoned investigators weren't prepared for what they'd find on his computer. Following Thomas Nick's arrest, authorities immediately began analyzing his personal belongings. The primary focus was his laptop. It was password protected, but digital forensics experts cracked the encryption fairly quickly. What they uncovered shocked even the most experienced members of the team. A folder named Sonderarchiv, German for Special Archive, contained hundreds of photos and videos, all involving teenage boys. Most appeared to be between the ages of 13 and 16. Some files had clearly been downloaded from the internet, but many were homemade, recorded by Thomas himself. Some were taken secretly in public spaces. Others were captured at closer range, from cafes, sports facilities, school events. But the most alarming discovery came from a subfolder labeled Zukunft, German for future. Inside was an Excel spreadsheet that listed names, approximate ages, schools, home addresses, mothers' names, daily routines. Information about 11 different boys. The level of detail mirrored what he had gathered about the Shower family. The file included eerie notes that read like surveillance logs. Monday, home alone after 4:30 p.m. Mother leaves for grocery store for 30 minutes. Entryway stays unlocked. Evening practice, empty from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Some notes were chilling in their mundanity. Bad day, everyone's home, we'll wait until Friday. These weren't just thoughts. This was a real plan, step by step. In his backpack, investigators found another kit: zip ties, duct tape, gloves, a lighter, adult-themed items, and a backup cell phone. Everything pointed to one conclusion. He had been preparing to commit another act of violence, eerily similar to the one from December 21st. So why didn't he follow through? Investigators believe that after the attack on the Shower family, Thomas decided to pause. The case had attracted too much attention. The risk was high. But it didn't mean he had abandoned his intentions. In fact, the files recovered from his laptop suggested he relived the crime. He rewatched the videos involving David, took screenshots of specific moments. It was clear he not only planned the act, but had derived satisfaction from it. A flash drive found in a hidden pocket of Thomas's bag contained 8 videos from the scene of the crime. All were filmed on his phone, The footage captured him tying up the family members, issuing threats, and tormenting David. These videos became key pieces of evidence in the case. The court viewed them behind closed doors per the judge's order to prevent further emotional trauma to the public. Psychiatric experts who analyzed Thomas's behavior noted a complete lack of empathy. His speech was cold, calculated. He showed no signs of guilt or shame. He openly admitted he had derived satisfaction from his actions. He even added that, "Next time I'd be more careful," and wouldn't repeat the mistake with the fire. As if he were discussing a failed experiment instead of a human tragedy. Law enforcement realized that if not for the DNA collection during the roadside check, this individual might have struck again. In another home, with another family, in another town, and the cycle would have started all over again. The trial of Thomas Nick began on March 13, 2018, at the district court in Lenzburg. The courtroom was packed and tense. Family members of the victims, members of the media, psychologists, and observers all understood this wasn't just about a violent crime. It was something that would leave a permanent mark on the country's history. Thomas entered the courtroom with a blank, emotionless expression. Flanked by 2 guards, he wore a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, hands clasped in front of him. He walked calmly, as if arriving for a routine meeting. The court charged him with multiple counts: the taking of 4 lives, acts of aggression, hostage-taking, extortion, arson intended to destroy evidence, creation and possession of harmful content, planning additional criminal acts. The evidence against him wasn't just strong, it was airtight. DNA at the scene, ATM surveillance footage, incriminating video files, his laptop archive, witness testimonies. But what struck everyone the most was his absolute candor. Thomas confessed to everything, without emotion, calmly, step by step. He described how he entered the house, gained Carla's trust, restrained the family, tormented David, and then carried out each fatal act. He detailed how he set the house on fire afterward. Then he said something that silenced the entire room. "Yes, this is who I am. I'm aware of it. I don't regret what I wanted. I suppressed it for 10 years. And then I decided to give myself the right to experience it. It was my only real fantasy, and I made it real." When the judge asked if he believed he could ever return to society, Thomas responded, "Yes. If given the chance, I'll get a couple of dogs and live a quiet life. I won't let my fantasies take over again." His comment about wanting a quiet life with dogs felt like a cruel joke. No one in the courtroom could comprehend how a person responsible for such a brutal act could even mention peace. The judge ordered that the crime scene videos, recorded by Thomas himself, be shown in a closed session. The footage captured everything: the commands, the restraints, the cruelty, and the aggression. Forensic analysts confirmed the videos were authentic. Even seasoned legal professionals admitted they had never seen anything so horrifying. Prosecutors with decades of experience confessed they had to leave the room. The defense didn't contest Thomas's guilt. Their only request was to have him declared mentally competent, in hopes of avoiding the classification of permanently dangerous. Prosecutors, on the other hand, demanded the maximum penalty allowed under Swiss law: indefinite imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But achieving that in Switzerland is complicated. A person can only be sentenced to true life imprisonment if they are formally recognized as untreatable for life. That made the psychiatric report the turning point. The experts acknowledged a severe psychological condition, but stopped short of declaring it irreversible. That technical detail left a legal loophole. The court sentenced Thomas Nick to an indeterminate prison term, with a review of his case allowed after a minimum of 20 years. That doesn't mean he will be released, but it means he could have a chance. He was also ordered to pay 700,000 Swiss francs to the families of the victims, 525,000 Swiss francs in legal and court fees. The relatives of the victims stated plainly they didn't care about the money. They only wanted one thing: that he never be released. Even after the trial ended, the country remained shaken. For Switzerland, a nation known for its calm, order, and safety, The crimes of Thomas Nick were nothing short of a national trauma. In a small village where nearly everyone knew each other by name, it turned out a monster had been living among them, planning violence for months while remaining completely unnoticed. People were scared, not just by what had happened, but by how easily Thomas had managed to gain trust, quietly observe his victims, plan everything step by step, stroll past Carla's house, and then sit down for dinner at a restaurant on the same day the crime was committed. He walked his dogs, posted smiling selfies online, and looked completely normal. No one imagined that someone like him could be capable of such cruelty, and that was the most terrifying part. The public began to talk about a failure in the system. How could a person with such dangerous fantasies go unnoticed? As it later turned out, Thomas Nick had never been on any psychiatric watch list, had no criminal record, and wasn't even officially employed. He was listed as a volunteer coach, but in reality, he never showed up to any programs. He lived off his mother, maintained the appearance of an average guy, and spent evenings watching disturbing content at cafes using public Wi-Fi. Everything was done quietly, methodically, never drawing attention. When police revealed that his laptop contained a list of 11 boys he had already started monitoring, panic spread through the community. The notes included names, daily routines, schedules, home addresses, details like who was home when they left, and where they lived. It became painfully clear he hadn't planned to stop. He was preparing to do it again, and again. The attack on the Schauer family was just the beginning. Journalists called it the most horrifying case in modern Swiss history. It dominated headlines for weeks. For Carla's neighbors, it was deeply personal. Many blamed themselves for not noticing the red flags sooner. The most controversial part came when it was revealed that Thomas was not legally declared permanently dangerous. This meant that, technically, he could one day be released. The backlash was immediate. Thousands of people signed petitions demanding tougher laws. The victims' families spoke out bluntly. If he gets out, he'll do it again. Psychiatrists, reporters, and lawmakers began public discussions on how to prevent something like this from ever happening again. Thomas Nick wasn't someone who snapped in a moment of despair. He was calculated, cold, and had spent years preparing for his day. He studied, analyzed, manipulated, and ultimately executed his horrific plan down to the last detail. Schools began offering lessons on personal safety. Neighbors became more attentive to one another. Law enforcement increased monitoring of suspicious behavior online. Many admitted this case was a wake-up call. Even in the most peaceful countries, darkness can exist, and evil often hides behind the most ordinary smile. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.